Well, damn, Orville. You continue to freaking impress me. Hello, everybody, and welcome to my review of the latest episode of the Orville New Horizons. This time, episode 5, A Tale of Two Topas. And I have to say this right up front. This is quite possibly not only my favorite episode of the Orville this season, but my favorite episode of the Orville overall. And I understand I'm saying that given my own bias, given the subject matter of this episode, but I was deeply impressed with this episode. And I should say this right up front, I want to apologize again that I am not appearing on camera for this review, considering that I myself am recovering from my own recent gender confirmation type of surgery, so my face is still all healing. So I just want to say that up front. But jumping off of that, this episode is also dealing with very complicated issues surrounding intersex issues stemming from the ongoing storyline that we've had on the Orville going all the way back to season 1's episode, I think it's like the 3rd episode of the series, about a girl. And I have made no bones about the fact that I have been very, very critical about the Orville when it has come to LGBTQ issues, and in specific how it has handled this storyline involving Topa being an intersex metaphor character for the Mocklins. I'm not going to go into all the nitty-gritty of my thoughts on all the way that this storyline has unfolded over the past few seasons, but just to give you a short version of it, I really was disappointed in the way the first season episode About a Girl kind of mixed transgender, intersex, and women's rights issues in a way that felt very, very muddled, and I appreciate the sentiment, but I really just thought that the episode just did a bad job at sort of distinguishing where these issues overlapped and intersected and where they didn't, in a way that felt very confusing, not only for someone who knew a lot about these issues going into that episode, but probably even more so for someone who didn't know much about these issues at all. And considering the Orville wishes to educate about these issues with storylines like this, I thought it really failed at doing that. And then when we got to season 2's episode Deflectors, which kind of delved a little bit more into Mocklin society and using that for a way to depict LGBTQ oppression, using a sort of straight-coded relationship in order to do that, I was appreciative of that episode a little bit more in how it depicted how these bigotries gets formed, but still felt that it was otherizing of LGBTQ folks by only having us exist in alien metaphor in a way that Next Generation did in its time in the 80s, but I feel like was a little bit dated for the Orville, and I am still very critical, and I also disliked how that episode had a barrier gaze ending much in the same way that TNG did with its episode that dealt with similar issues like The Outcast back in the early 90s. And I am still very critical to this day, to this season, that we don't have any explicit LGBTQ non-metaphorical human characters on the show, at least to my knowledge. There might be someone, but I couldn't really think of them off the top of my head. So I am still critical of the show in that aspect. That all being said, coming into this episode, I was very, very reticent to see them tackling this storyline again, because I knew they were going to have to deal with it, but the way that I've had issues with how the show has come about that in the past had me very, very worried about how they were going to handle it. But as I sat and watched this episode go through and delve into these complex issues of how to deal with a character like Topa, who is very much an intersex character who had a procedure placed upon them against their consent and wishes at a young age before they could even be aware of such a procedure in a way that many intersex people in real life have to deal with. I thought that they handled it really, really well, and delving into the complex morals of the situation, not just between parents, not between parents and kids, but also between kids and parents and other people in their lives, seeing how Kelly deals with it, as well as how this can even get embroiled into political discussions, and given a lot of our discourse around gender affirming care here in the United States today and how it has been so vilified and targeted and attacked by many right-wing groups, I thought the way that this was handled was just absolutely wonderful. And honestly, my only major critique coming out of this episode for myself is that I honestly wish that episodes prior to this one had actually done a better service to this episode, because there's a couple moments that I don't think read as well as they could have if this episode had been built up to properly in past seasons. But within this episode itself, I think they got so much right, and I'm so excited to just delve into it and talk about it with all of you, because I was just very, very pleased at how much of an improvement that this episode did over past seasons. So let's delve into it. I'm going to go into this beat by beat because I think this episode really deserves it. We start off the episode with the crew down on a planet sort of doing a excavation of a tomb. I thought that this was all kind of fun. I like seeing that Ed was writing letters to his daughter, showing that continuity there and a little bit of growth for Ed. You also get a little fun with Isaac opening up the tomb and having the darts hit him. I thought that was just all sort of fun and a nice background element for the episode. But then we go up to see Topa in the holodeck doing a kind of Kobayashi Maru training simulator. And I'm going to say this right up front. I'm going to use she, her pronouns for Topa throughout this episode discussion because those are the pronouns that she chose to use by the end of the episode. So that's what I'm going to be using for this review. But I really liked seeing her kind of have a moment of rage and hitting the console in anger, because this read so true, because a lot of people who are often dealing with these questions of identity but are unable to voice it because they haven't been able to give representation to it, but they're dealing with all these thoughts and even suicidal thoughts, will often express anger and rage because that's the only way that they know how to express themselves. I myself expressed that as a young kid dealing with my own transgender related issues because I once punched through a wall in anger, and I had a lot of anger issues growing up because of these feelings that I just didn't know how to express. So all of that read really, really well. And I like that Topa goes to Kelly to say, like, hey, I'm looking for something in my life to feel a sense of identity through. And we often see that a lot of trans and intersex people dealing with these issues often enter into the military because they feel like something's wrong and they want to reaffirm their masculinity in some ways because that's the only way that they know how to do it, because they feel like they're lacking in other elements of their life. You often see a disproportionate amount of trans women entering into military service. That's actually a larger disproportion of trans people entering the military because of this very reason. So all of that read really well, and I love seeing Topa go with Kelly about her daily sort of routine. I like seeing the culture clash issue. I thought that was really nice, of just like how faith in the Union was sort of dealt with, and Kelly having to come to a compromise about having this crew member put on pants. I thought that was wonderful. And it should be noted that this discussion of cultural clashes is foreshadowing of the entire culture clash that we have with Moclan society throughout this episode. So nice subtle seeding there. And then I liked Topa starting to open up to Kelly because she starts to see herself in Kelly in a lot of different ways, because she's starting to understand a little bit of her feelings and sort of connect with Kelly as a woman, but not really knowing how to voice that, and even sort of oblongly referencing possible suicidal thoughts. Again, something that many kids who don't know how to discuss or talk about these issues will feel and might share with someone outside of their family unit, usually a teacher, possibly at school, but in this case being Kelly, because they don't really know how to express it elsewhere at home because that's a much more complicated environment. So all of this, just to a T, was just well depicted. And I love that then Kelly goes to talk to Bortus and Clyden, because that's what you should do in this situation. She doesn't want to overstep Topa's parents, but also is wanting to warn them about Topa having very real issues and problems stemming from something that she knows they have a right to know. Topa had a procedure put upon her against her wishes at birth. And this is something that many intersex people deal with, that they are given surgeries against their will as kids that make them have their bodies aligned with one gender or another because they don't fit into the way that society thinks their body should be. And it is often terrible and harmful, and many intersex people often do feel these very same feelings that Topa felt in this episode. So Topa has a right to know, but I like Kelly going to Topa's parents first, and Clyden expressing very real feelings about the matter. And I want to say this, Clyden has been depicted as a very bigoted person throughout the entirety of the series. But I like in this moment that Clyden deals with his own feelings in a very unhealthy way, that he's sort of putting his feelings about his own body and life and his shame and his own experience in life onto Topa. And that is wrong. But it comes from a very real emotional place. And the line where he says, I would rather him feel unhappy than despair. That is not a right thing for him to put upon Topa, because that is something that he is feeling, not Topa. But I understand where it is coming from, and this sort of bigotry and this internalized self-hatred is something that a lot of people will sometimes go through in older age once they sort of have wrestled with a lot of these issues and feel like, oh, there's nothing I can do to make my life better. A lot of sort of older trans and intersex people sometimes feel that despair because they don't feel like they can get to live a life that they wanted to because of either, money reasons, societal reasons, sort of being discriminatory against them, numerous different things. But that is his his own bullshit that he is placing onto Topa. And I love Bortus trying to be there for Clyden and understanding and being respectful of Clyden, but also being like, no, this is bullshit and you don't get to do this to our child. And Bortus reconciling with all the complicated nature of that as well. And then this coming out with Clyden trying to exert some form of control by forbidding Topa from talking to Kelly, trying to limit Topa's access to these feelings. But that's obviously not going to work. It's just going to make Topa feel worse, as we see with Topa going to talk to Isaac about suicidal thoughts and killing yourself. Again, something that we sadly see a lot of in the LGBTQ community and the intersex community, with people being unable to express these thoughts. And I really appreciated Isaac doing the right thing too and saying like, look, I'm going to go to Kelly and tell her what Topa told me and I thought that was just done in an incredibly professional manner. And I just really, really loved it. And then Kelly reaching out as a friend to Topa, saying like, this isn't me as a person that you want to look up to. This is me as a friend saying, I'm here for you if you want to talk. And not pushing Topa to talk about something, but just saying that I am here and being a place to feel safe to talk to. I thought was perfect of Kelly. But then we get into something that I was initially very hesitant about, which was that Kelly goes around Clyden and Bortus's wishes by sort of hinting to Topa about the file that will tell her about her trial. I was initially very worried about this because what I feel like the right thing to do in this situation would have been to visit the parents one more time and say, hey, look, your kid is having suicidal thoughts. But I also understand Kelly feeling that it was the right thing to do to just say, hey, Clyden's not going to do anything. Topa has a right to know this information, so I'm going to give it to her. And I like that after that happens, Kelly goes and talks to Claire and says, I wondered if I did the right thing. Am I wrong? Did I overstep my bounds? She even says that to Bortus later on. And I liked her wrestling with the complicated nature of that because it's a very morally gray thing to do. I happen to think that Topa has a right to know, and I think Kelly was absolutely right in doing this. But I understand the complicated feelings around it, and I like that Kelly gets to express that complicated feelings around the moral complexity of this, rather than it just being assumed that she is absolutely right in having done so and being completely confident in that. And I thought that was just wonderfully depicted and assuaged my fears about how that was being shown. But then we get a really wonderful scene where Topa confronts Bortus and Clyden. I thought the way that this was depicted was perfect. Clyden lying to Topa first, but then Bortus eventually telling the truth. And I love that Bortus tries initially to stand together with Clyden, that he sort of looks at Clyden and says like, look, this is something that we were unsure about. He doesn't sort of place it all on Clyden saying like, Clyden wanted to tell you, I did, but Clyden didn't. No, he stands firm as a partner with Clyden. And not lying to Topa, saying, like, we didn't know, but not necessarily throwing Clyden under the bus in that moment. And I thought that was a really tight rope that Bortus was walking, and I liked him sort of dealing with the complexity of caring for his child, but also wanting to make sure to sort of reaffirm that Topa's parents love her in this moment. And I thought that it was just very, very wonderfully thoughtful on Bortus's part. But then we get Clyden trying to exert his rage by going to Kelly and yelling at her and sort of saying, oh, you wanted to play God, and Kelly calling Clyden out and just saying, no, you were wrong. I think that Topa had every right to know this knowledge. There is one line, though, however, in this moment that I will say I think worked in this episode, but one that just sort of coming off of the issues with the way that the storyline has been represented in past episodes that I think will read a little bit problematic to people who may not be aware of these issues. There was a line where Kelly says, underneath that manufactured exterior, Topa is still female. Now, that is a great line to use when we talk about intersex storylines because Topa had a surgery put upon her that she did not consent to. However, because the show has in the past mixed transgender and intersex issues, the wording of the word manufactured exterior and sort of this call to like is still female, this sort of call to like biological essentialism, I think could be read by some people who have often called for like essentialist definitions like you're still a woman if you have a vagina sort of thing, and that trans people's bodies who have had gender affirming surgeries like myself to get a vaginoplasty are sort of manufactured and that our genitals are just like mutilated forms. I think that could be read by people who sort of don't understand the difference between intersex and transgender issues in a way that could be used and wielded against trans people. I know that that's kind of a really difficult to muddle through because I also don't want to fall into the trap of saying like intersex issues shouldn't be talked about in this way. I think that this is not a problem within the episode to discuss intersex issues in this way, just more a fact of the show having mixed these issues up in a way that for someone who is not necessarily part of these communities might misunderstand. And so I think that this also goes back to my issues with this show only showcasing LGBTQ issues within alien metaphor, because by only showing these issues within alien metaphor, it does allow for these misunderstandings to possibly happen. It's why when I say that I like shows like this using metaphor to discuss these issues, but still having literal representation of marginalized groups within them, I think is so important. It's why I love things like Star Trek Discovery, which I don't think has done discussions of these issues as well as the Orville is doing here in this episode yet, but I do at least appreciate the explicit representation of trans and LGBTQ issues over in that show, because it does allow trans and LGBTQ people to exist as ourselves within that show and then have our issues discussed separately from it. But I think that the Orville is doing these discussions better here, but because there is no literal representation, can be misinterpreted by those who don't understand as well. So that's just one thing that I wanted to sort of toss into this mixture that I sort of thought about within this scene. But it's still a really well done scene in and of itself. Then we have a quick scene that I talked about earlier where Kelly sort of acknowledges that she was out of line, but I love that Bortus had a hand in it too, that he had some sort of agency in allowing Topa to figure out her identity and that he was wrestling with his feelings on it. I also love that Claire next scene becomes a mental health counselor and saying that Topa will guide us in how we do this, that it wasn't sort of like people around Topa sort of telling her how to feel, but that they were letting Topa guide them. That is such a perfect way to talk about transgender and intersex and LGBTQ healthcare when dealing with these things, that you let the kid, the child, be able to tell you what they need rather than the other way around, because that is often put upon them by our society saying, you need to do this, you need to be this. But actually letting the kid dictate that, I thought worked really well. And then we get to see Kelly reaffirming love and care for Topa, but then getting to show Topa the female Mocklin that we met back in About a Girl and sort of recontextualizing that scene as a scene of representation for Topa, allowing her to see herself and showing the importance of being able to see yourself in media that makes you able to articulate what you actually want. By seeing what you want to be, you can become it. And that's sort of what solidifies in her that she wants to get this procedure. And I thought that that was a perfect way to just showcase how representation matters and can be incredibly important. And then after this, we start to have the discussion about whether or not Topa should be allowed to have the procedure. One thing I wish to note, everyone on the crew, besides Clyden, who is bigoted, everyone on the crew instantly genders Topa correctly. Everyone uses she, her pronouns for her from this point on, and that is freaking perfect. Amazing. I adored that to death, and it was just such a great, great thing for this show to do and depict. That once Topa said that I am a woman, everyone gendered her correctly, and there was no question of it. Other than Clyden, who obviously is the one wrestling and having sort of discriminatory thoughts about all of this, so that fit that he would not. And then the way that gender-affirming care was discussed here was wonderful, because we do have complicated discussions about, is Topa too young to make this decision? But then already this surgery has already been done to her, so the harm has already been done, and it's up to Topa to be able to decide this. And we have discussions about kids being able to consent in these matters and whether or not a parent should consent in these wishes. And there is a complicated discussion still ongoing to this day, even removed from the political discourse, about what's the right age for consent, whether a parent should be involved in the decision, whether it should be the kid, whether if it's parents discriminating, whether they should be involved. I mean, places like we're seeing in Washington, I think just today as I'm recording this, announced that they are going to allow kids to seek gender-affirming care without parents' consent, especially if those parents are bigoted, but also needing sort of doctor and therapist acknowledgement as well within that. It's a complicated question that I don't think has specific answers as of yet, and we can sort of have this discussion about those lines of consent. But this episode, I think, was sort of wrestling with that in an interesting way, and I did really like that, and I liked sort of saying, Bortus, like saying, I will go and allow Topa to get this procedure, but Clyden pushing against it and only needing one's parents' consent for this moment. But then this does get wrapped up into political ramifications, which again perfectly mirrors the way that transgender healthcare has been kind of vilified in our society today. Mocklins in the Union are this important political force because they're a key ally in keeping the Kalons at bay. And so the union is willing to not allow Topa to have her own bodily autonomy because there's this political discourse going on that they're sort of letting the Mocklans, who are these very, very bigoted society, to dictate human rights and bodily autonomy of someone else. I mean, if we're going to talk politics today, talk about Roe v. Wade and how the right-wing and conservative groups are being able to dictate the bodily autonomy of women across this country, around this country in the United States. Trans healthcare as well has been vilified by these same groups, saying that trans people don't have a right to understand and be able to care for our own bodies in the way that we should be able to, because they get to control the discourse, even though quite often we see that a minority of people hold these bigoted beliefs, but they have sort of control over the larger discourse. I mean, most people don't support the knocking down of Roe v. Wade in this country, and yet it still happened. So I think that way that this was depicted here in terms of how the politics denied Topa a sense of bodily autonomy, perfect way to display that. And Topa feeling a sense of despair in that, like Clyden did, by the way, because she is not able to decide her own body. And she says, all right, well, I'm not going to fight anymore. I'm just going to be the best man that I can be to reaffirm her maleness, because if she can't be a woman, I guess she'll just be a man. Again, why we see many women, trans women, going into the military to sort of do those same sort of things. But then we get Finn on the planet saying, well, I can leave the union to become a civilian doctor in order to do this procedure. And I'm like, Finn, you are the best. I adore you for being willing to sacrifice your career for this kid because it was the right thing to do. And it could not have made me love her character more. I adored her, but I did like that there was a workaround in that Isaac could perform the procedure because he was not a union officer. And Ed orders him not to do it, but obviously is ordering him to do it. And they sort of get everyone to avoid the procedure by having Bortus sing a concert, which was very fun, very Orville. That felt like that comedy that the Orville uses, sort of slight irreverence that we probably wouldn't have seen on something like The Next Generation, but still is very funny. I thought that felt very Orville, that this is the way that they went about it. But then we have Topa going in for the surgery with Isaac and feeling fear. And this is something that I felt with my own vaginoplasty. When I went in for my own vaginoplasty, it was something, I mean, every one of my gender-affirming surgeries that I've had, I felt fear because surgery is scary. It is very scary, even though it was something that I wanted my entire life. And so still having fear in that moment felt very real. I felt fear in those moments. And wow, what just a great understanding of that moment of wanting something but still being scared. And Isaac having a bedside manner in that moment too, just learning to be more, for lack of a better word, human. Just showing Isaac getting character development here in this was great too. And then Clyden coming in and using words like describing Topa's body as monstrous. Again, words that we see many anti-transgender and anti-intersex people using against the LGBTQ community. Words like monstrous, deformed, well represented in Clyden's bigotry there. And then Isaac just being, I loved his line, your capacity for reason has been compromised by your cultural indoctrination. Isaac, I am here for you. Oh my God, I loved it. That line, I might steal that line. It was great. Oh, I just thought that was great. And then Topa gets the surgery, and I loved that the show used beautiful music for Topa's surgery, that it was a beautiful moment for her. I thought that was just a perfect choice. The one thing I will say that I might not love about this scene, and I have complicated feelings on it, is that when she has the procedure done, her face looks more kind of stereotypically feminine. I think her eyebrows, the makeup had her eyebrows going up, and also I think they lightened her skin as well. I might be wrong on that, but I think they lightened her skin to give her a more lighter feminine feel, which could be considered colorism to a degree, as well as just also women having makeup on as well. There's some sort of stereotypical femme coding in that moment that I understand why they did it, but I am someone who quite literally just got my face cut open to make myself more femme appearing, so I'm not knocking it necessarily. I just sort of have complicated feelings on it, and I just watched the episode, so it's one that I'll have to wrestle with a little bit before I sort of say one way or the other, but I was sort of a little bit I'm not entirely sure I like the overly femme coding of her immediately outside of this procedure, but it was a little subtle thing for that. Then we get the Admiral chewing up Kelly and Ed in this moment and calling him insubordinate and incompetent, but then also doing that sort of thing. But it's I will chew you out next time. But also, you kind of did right. And so that moment was, kind of stereotypical, but I liked. And I did like that there was this sort of loophole of the Mocklins were not going to leave the Union because they now are angrier at the Kalons because Isaac performed the procedure, which was sort of a nice workaround in order to make everything like this political status quo still work. I would have been interested to see if the Mocklins actually had pulled out. That would have been a cool, interesting bit of continuity if the Mocklins had pulled out of the Union, and now we have to wrestle with that. So that would have been an interesting storyline to go down if the show had wanted to do that. I would have honestly been curious to see how that would have worked. But I'm fine with it not having been the case either way. I think both work. One would have been more complicated storyline down the road, but it's fine in terms of keeping the status quo here for this story to not complicate it even further going on here. But then we have Clyden leaving his family because of this procedure, and honestly, fuck Clyden for saying, I wish you were never born to Topa. That was absolutely horrific and awful, and something that you see many parents do, disowning their intersex child because they are who they are and trying to live as their most authentic selves. So fuck Clyden. But then Bortus was the perfect parent, because when he turns and looks at Topa and says, listen to me, you are perfect. That is exactly what Topa needed to hear in that moment, because she just had a parent tell her that he wishes that she had never been born. And so she needed to hear from the other parent, like, no, you are perfect. The exact right thing for Bortus to say, to reaffirm her in that moment. I could have hugged Bortus so hard in that moment, just being an absolutely perfect parent. And then to have the episode end with Topa just getting to be on the bridge and having that moment, smiling and being herself, was absolutely beautiful. I also should say there was that wonderful little moment with Isaac where Isaac admits that he did it for himself. He did the procedure for himself because he wants the people on the ship to like him a little bit more. It was done in self-interest, which I think is very honest, which I thought was like, I thought that made sense, that he was a little bit of a self-interest in that, but still doing the right thing, I thought was nice. It kind of shows, for example, how when we talk about things like narcissism, people can be narcissists and have self-interest, but still do good things. We tend to vilify narcissism in and of itself, as just like being narcissistic is flat awful. But narcissists are still people, and they still can be, do good things. Sometimes for self-interested reasons, but still do good things. And so I thought that was a good moment as well for Isaac as well. At the end of this, as you can clearly tell, while I have some little nitpicks here and there, this is well done. Absolutely well done. While I have issues still with LGBTQ representation in the Orville, and I have issues with past ways that this storyline has been handled, this episode, in and of itself, fantastic. I thought they really nailed the discussion that they wanted to have with this. And while I do think that there will be people who watch this episode who do not get it, who will misinterpret it because it is an alien metaphor, and I feel like that is always a failure of these shows when they don't have literal representation, there will be people who will misinterpret it. I swear to you, there'll probably be people on the line who will be like, this isn't about anything to do with intersex people or trans people or LGBTQ people at all. I don't understand. This is just alien stuff, or SJW is done. Like, they're going to do that. But to the writing staff of this episode, dealing with what they have to deal with coming into this episode, I thought they did it perfectly, or at least as close to perfect as I think it could be handled. So, well done. Well done. Orville, you impressed me again. 3 out of 5 episodes this season have been pretty freaking stellar, and the other 2 I didn't hate either. So, what a strong season so far for the Orville. And I am looking forward to next episode more than ever. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially if you are intersex. I've been speaking a lot about intersex issues here. I'm sure there's something that I got wrong. So if you are intersex, please let me know if there's something that I mistook or said wrong. I would love to be educated on all of that. Beyond all of that, thanks so much for listening. I hope that you all take care of yourselves. Look for my Star Trek Strange New Worlds review very soon as well. I hope that you all live long and prosper.